So welcome to the first of a two-part tutorial in modeling a crate. And the way we're going to separate these tutorials up is the first tutorial that I'm going to be doing now, the one you're watching, is going to be about modeling, specifically focusing on things like extrusion and inset and editing primitives. The second part of the tutorial is going to focus on unwrapping and texturing, so generating the materials for what we've modeled. So hopefully by the end of this two-part tutorial you should have a complete crate that's ready to be used in any kind of game engine, any kind of game environment. So the first step of this tutorial is to create a box. Now you'll notice that we have on the right hand side under the create tab, under geometry and within standard primitives, we have a massive, well, we don't have not massive amount, but we have a number of different primitives that we can select from. And obviously the one we're going to use today is box. But feel free to use others and play around with the modifiers we're going to use today. So I'm going to select box, I'm going to open up keyboard entry, and what I want to do is create a 40 by 40 by 40 box to start with in my perspective viewport. So I'm just going to expand this out, and we can do that by clicking the maximize viewport toggle button over here, unless you've got Windows 8, and then in which case what happens is as soon as you move over here this really bloody annoying bar appears and ruins everything. And the way we're going to create a 40 by 40 box is, you'll notice on the right hand side Max has kindly already filled mine out for me. But what we're going to do, in the length we're going to type 40. If we press tab on the keyboard, type 40 again, type 40 again, and then once we're done we're going to click create. Okay, and we should hopefully end up with our crate. Now, if I show you the other viewports, when we create it in perspective, it tends to centralize it. And that's because we're using, when we go into keyboard entry, we're using the length, width, and height segments rather than X, Y, Z. So the best way of remembering this is X, Y, Z is going to refer to the position on the grid that it's created, and length, width, and height is going to actually specify the actual geometry attributes. Okay, so the length, the width, and the height of the crate. Now, as with pretty much every standard primitive, we can't edit this in its current state, if you like. If we go over to the Modify tab, which is what I like to refer to as the rainbow tab, you'll notice that within this hierarchy we have box number 16. I'm not 100% sure why that's box number 16. But the first thing we're going to do is we're going to change this to crate. Okay, and if we just click in there, highlight whatever's there and just type crate, you'll notice underneath here we have modify list, and within this stack we have just nothing but box. And within here we can increase parameters like length segments, width segments, height segments. Now what we want to do is make sure that all of these are defaulted to 1. It is defaulted to 1 by normally, but if you've changed any of these settings previously, or you've been playing around before, these will remember previous settings that you've used. And just a quick point here, if you are following this tutorial and you're using 3ds Max Design, and you'll notice that I'm not, I'm just using the generic 3ds Max. If you're using 3ds Max Design at this point, you will need to make sure that you deselect real world map size. And the reason for this is that later on when we start adding checkered materials in the second part of the tutorial, this will become, well, it won't become a problem, but it will cause us a few issues, and you might have trouble following. So the next step really is to actually make this look more like a crate. So to do that, we're going to go to the modify list and we're going to click on the drop down arrow. You can click pretty much anywhere in here. It doesn't matter if you select the drop down arrow or anywhere in that box. Now the modifier we're looking for is edit poly, and there is a trick to navigating the massive selection of modifiers there are here. If you know the modifier that you want, and in this case it's edit poly, what we're going to do is we're going to press on the keyboard the first letter of that modifier, and what will happen is that 3ds Max takes us to the first modifier that starts with that letter, and what we can do then is press E again to cycle through until we get to edit poly. But feel free to just click edit poly. If you know where it is, just zoom down, click edit poly. Now the first thing you'll notice within this modifier is that we have a different number of selection types. Okay, and as I'm assuming that the majority of people following this tutorial are unfamiliar with these selection types, I'll go through them briefly. So the first one we're going to look at is vertex. Now, vertex vertexes are basically created, or vertices are created, when edges meet. So if I select vertex and I click on any of these blue dots, you'll notice that my gizmo, as this is called, jumps to that location. And what it means is that I can move those specific vertices and completely ruin my shape if I want to. Now, if this does happen at any point, feel free to pause the video. But what you need to do is press Ctrl Z, okay? And you can keep pressing Ctrl Z until you get back to the point where we have our 40 by 40 box, okay? So if you do make any mistakes, don't worry about it. We're all going to make mistakes. The chances are I'm going to screw up at some point during this tutorial. And what you'll see me Control Setting. So if I try something it doesn't work, I'll Control Z out of it, and I'll try and guide us through. The second selection type is Edge. And what Edge allows us to do is pretty self-explanatory. It allows us to select the edges. And the same rules apply. So I can move those edges. Border is slightly harder to explain. So in order to explain border properly, I'm just going to delete one of my polygons. So at this point, you can just sit there and watch, because we're not actually going to model a crate just yet. Now, borders are created where edges are not connected to polygons, or they're not connected on all sides to polygons. So, for example, I have a polygon connected to these edges, all down here. So we have polygons connected, but there's a big hole up the top. All right. Now I can use the border tool to select that entire open space. Okay, and this is essentially what's known as a border. All right. The next one is polygon, and I think that one is pretty self-explanatory too. So we're just going to click on these polygons, and you can kind of see what it does. Element basically selects the entire object. Now, element becomes really handy later on if you have lots and lots of different objects connected together, and you can use element to kind of select between them all. And we will be using, mainly today, we'll be using polygon and element selection types. So the first step really of creating our crate is we're going to press Ctrl A on the keyboard. And this is going to allow us to select every face of our cube. Okay. We're then going to come down to this bottom right hand corner of our menu, and we're going to click on the box next to Inset. And the reason why we're not just going to click Inset is because if we just click Inset, you'll notice that I can't actually change anything. It doesn't work. Alright. Now this becomes evident when I open up the menu for Inset. When I've selected the entire cube, it won't actually let me inset these polygons separately. And the reason for that is because 3ds Max is treating these as a group, and it can't work out how to calculate that in 3D, if that makes sense. So the way that we're going to inset these is we're going to click on this drop down arrow, and we're going to go to by polygon. And what this changes is it changes 3ds Max perception of this cube. So now each of these polygons are its own entity. And we're just going to slowly move this up, and you'll notice that we end up with creating polygons within polygons. Okay. Now at this point, it's important to remember that when we see this happening, this is good. This is what we want to see. If you overextend this inset, you will get what we call Z fighting. All right. Now that's when you have a front face and a back face, or two front faces or two back faces occupying the same space. All right. And what's happened here is we have this new polygon that's been created has essentially flipped and is now expanding into this geometry. Now, I've been teaching 3D modeling for 4 or 5 years now, and every time I've done this tutorial, somebody has overextended. So just make sure that what we are seeing is an empty red square. We don't want to see this. So this is bad, and this is good. Okay. So we're just gonna scale this in. Now the good thing about insetting as a group is that every polygon is inset by the same amount. We don't have to worry about selecting this one and selecting this one and making sure it's the same. Okay. The next step is to extrude these inwards. Okay. Now, what we need to do is we need to select these individual polygons. But you'll notice that as I click, I can only kind of select one at a time. I can't multiple select yet. So in order to enable that, what we need to do is hold Control. And as we hold Control and click, you'll notice that I can select multiple polygons. Alright? And I can do this for any of these selection types. Once we've selected these central polygons, what we're going to do is we're going to come again down to this right hand corner and we're going to click on Extrude. And at this point, it doesn't matter if you click on the Extrude button or the menu. I tend to prefer the menu because it gives me slightly more accurate numbers, if that makes sense. If I show you just the Extrude, it doesn't. I mean, I can do it, but I can't see. You know, for example, I can't see how far in it is, or you know what the number is defaulted to. All right. Now, same remember with the inset. What we don't want is this. Now you'll see over in this corner. Can you see what's happening here? This is what happens when we extrude polygons into other polygons. So we've extruded these back, and remember we're extruding in all directions. So we're extruding each one of these polygons back into the center of the cube, and inevitably there will be a point in time where they collide. This is not desirable. This is not something that we want. And the reason for that is because when we come to unwrap this, and when we come to render it, what we're seeing is back faces. And it will essentially just be a black hole in your cube. What it will also mean as well, when we come to unwrap this later, it becomes incredibly difficult for 3ds Max to map these areas. Because when we apply what we call a projection modifier, which we'll talk about later on, it doesn't understand what's going on. So same as before, we just need to make sure that we don't have any of these cross lines. So just about there. So mine is 2.1-ish. And feel free, this is your crate, you can have it, you can have a really shallow extrude, or you can have a slightly deeper extrude. I'm just going to click the tick there. Okay. So at this point, we have the outline of a cube. But you'll notice, for some reason, that I'm now no longer rotating around the cube. Okay. If this happens, then feel free to just press Z on your keyboard, or Z if you're American, and that should hopefully zoom all extents and refocus the camera around our cube. Alright, so we now have the base model, if you like, and we can, if you want to, completely stop there with this tutorial. You don't have to model the central slats that we're going to move on to next. You can just skip to the next tutorial and go on to unwrapping the cube. But if you wish to look at modeling the slats, then that's what we're going to do next. So to do this, I'm going to come out of this viewport. I'm going to go back to my 4x4 grid. Okay? My 2x2. And I'm in the front viewport. Doesn't necessarily matter which, to be honest, it could be any of them. I'm going to come back to my Create tab, and I'm going to place another box. Alright, so we're going to create a new object. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new box that is the same width as the entirety of our cube. Okay? And if you have a look in the perspective viewport just below where I am, you'll see as I move my mouse up and down in the front viewport that I can specify the depth, if you like, of that slat. And something about that. Alright, that's what we're looking for. And once we've done that, if we just right click in the perspective viewport, and if we just drag this separate cube out, that'll be awesome. And then we can actually see it. So now we're going to expand this viewport again. And you'll notice that we have a new object. Now, the same as we did with the cube, or the crate, we're going to need to give this a new name. It doesn't matter if you don't give it a new name, but when you have got, later on, when we reference this around the cube, you're going to have 8 or 9 different objects in the scene. And trying to remember what they're all called, or trying to remember which one's which, can be really difficult. So it's a really good habit to get into naming your objects that you place in the scene. So at this point, I have my crate and I have my first slat. Now if I just dump this slat into my cube, rotate it around, etc., you'll notice that it doesn't quite fit. It's not quite big enough because we want it to span from this corner all the way through into this corner. Alright? And the other thing you might notice is that we have polygons at the back here and at the top. Now, from an optimization point of view, it may only be 3 polygons, and that isn't a massive number. But you can imagine, if we multiply this, say 6 or 7 times, the number of polygons that we're going to have that are going to be unseen. Because remember, this part of the cube, or this part of the slat, is going to be buried into the crate, and this part of is also going to be buried over here. And of course, we're not going to see the back face because that's going to be intersected into our crate. Alright, we're going to have a massive number of wasted polygons. Oh good, it's Stacey Phillips' birthday tomorrow. Alright, so with this, what we can do, or what we're going to have to do, is we're going to delete these extra polygons. Because like I said before, you can imagine, if you have 300 or 400 of these crates in a scene, and you've got all those wasted polygons, from an optimization point of view, that isn't going to be particularly handy. Okay? So again, same different. I'm going to come up to the modifier list. I'm going to go to edit poly, and I'm going to select polygon. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to select this very top face, the back face, and then this bottom face, and I'm going to press delete. So what we should have is almost like a square gutter. That should be what we end up with. And you'll notice that now when I intersect this, we don't have to worry too much about those wasted polygons, all right? Because the only polygons we're going to see are the ones that are still alive, if you like. We've killed the useless ones. So the next step is to scale this out. So what we're going to do is we're going to come up top left hand corner and we're going to select the select and uniform scale button. Now if you're a hotkey fan, a quick note, if we press W on the keyboard, that gives us translate or select and move. If we press E, that gives us rotate. And if we press R, that gives us scale. Okay. Now you may notice that when we select this scale, it doesn't really give us much options in terms of scaling this to a point where it will fit. We can't just scale it on this axis. We have to scale it in the center. Now this is because 3ds Max is using a specific type of axes. And you notice if we come up to this top left hand corner, just right to the selecting uniform, it will say view. Now what this is doing is it's basically giving us this gizmo from the point of view of the direction essentially that we are looking at this shape. And we don't want that. For the most part, view is absolutely fine. There's no reason why that isn't a problem. But what we want is local. So if we click on view, and we come down to local, you'll notice that the axis here changes. Okay, you'll notice that the x-axis now is local to this specific object. Okay, and what we can do at this point is we can just select that x-axis, and we know when we've selected it because it goes green or yellow. And we can just slide towards the corners. Okay? And once we've done, we can just deselect the object. And you'll notice now that we have a slat that fits. Alright? So you can now spend a little bit of time just centralizing that, making sure that it is in fact rotated 45 degrees, etc. Okay? So there we go. That's my slat. Now at this point, guys, feel free to shift and drag this crate or this slat round to create what we call a reference. Okay. Now that's essentially what we're going to do next. So we've got one, but we need the others. We need them on all of the faces. Okay. And I don't necessarily mind, and it doesn't really matter what faces you put these slats on. Okay. So you can put them all across the center, or you can have none, or you can have crosses on every single face. But what's important is when we copy this. Alright, when we create a new image or create a new object, when we do shift drag, okay, irregardless of whether or not it's shift dragging through. So if I shift drag this now using the move tool, if I shift and drag to pull that through, I get an option pop up, my clone options. What I want is reference. And the reason why I want that is because later on, if we want to edit any of these crates or any of these slats, or we want to unwrap any of them, it means that we only have to unwrap the original. If we unwrap the original, the others will all be unwrapped, okay? And trust me, it is much, much easier to do it that way than it is to unwrap them all separately, especially if you don't like unwrapping, okay? So now that I've copied this one through, created a clone, I need to rotate it 180 degrees on the red axis, alright? Now, of course you can just select that axis and you can rotate it over, and you'll notice that we get some yellow numbers. And I'm going to spend a ridiculous amount of time now trying to get 180.0. Okay, and you'll notice that basically in this viewport it can be very, very difficult to get that. Now 3ds Max has a tool that enables us to do this, and it's called angle snaps. And we can enable this by moving our mouse up to the top toolbar here. And what we want is angle snap toggle. With this enabled, we get a 5-degree angle snap, and you'll notice that getting 180 now is really, really easy. So once I've rotated that by 180, I'm going to select this y-axis and I'm just going to drag that into my crate. Okay, and again, just make sure that you use the Alt and middle click to rotate around and make sure you don't have any part of this slat poking out of the edge. Alright, and I'm just going to do that for the other bits too. Okay, fantastic. So the next part is to do exactly the same. So we're going to shift and drag and make sure that it's referenced. And you'll notice that because we gave our original slat a unique name, 3ds Max is essentially giving us a number system based on the original. Okay, so I'm going to click OK. Same thing, except this time I'm going to rotate 90 degrees. I'm just going to select the blue axis and I'm going to rotate 90 degrees. Alright. Now, I'm sure there are some people watching that have got OCD when it comes to object placement. Okay, feel free to almost chain these up if you like, if it makes you feel better. The difference it makes is there is no difference whatsoever. It can sometimes make things look slightly better, but for most part, it doesn't actually matter at all. So the last slat for these width segments, we're just going to place this in here. Okay, so now I have the central part of my cube anyway has now been inundated with extra slats. Now for me to be able to check whether or not these are insected enough or whether they are poking out, it can be quite difficult in this mode. Now you'll notice that I can see the edges, but I can't actually see the white edges. I can see the shape. Now 3ds Max has got a hotkey for this. If we press F4 in this current configuration, you'll notice that I get my edges. Alright, I'll be able to see them. If I press F3, I get rid of all of that diffuse, so I get rid of all the geometry, and I'm just left with those edges. Okay, this is what we call wireframe. And this can be very, very useful for seeing, certainly later on, you know, how close these extrudes are together, or how overlapped our insets are if we're having errors with that. But for the most part, we're going to just be using this viewport. Okay, this particular view type. And you notice when I select my edges, or when I enable them, over here I have a crafty edge poking out. So again, I'm just going to move this out. And it's probably a good idea just to spend a little bit of time focusing on just moving them out if needs be. Okay, so they're fine. So at this point, guys, feel free to copy and paste the slats to the top. I'm gonna have a cross section on the top, and I'm gonna leave the slats as one by one. But feel free if you want to have cross sections on every face. It doesn't matter. Okay, the most important thing is that you just use reference. Okay, that's the most important thing. You can have as many as you like. You can even have sort of like a Union Jack thing going on. You know, if you scale them back, etc. It doesn't matter. It's absolutely fine. But just make sure you use reference. So same process. I'm going to speed up a little bit now because at this point you can pause and move and pause and move and pause and move. So same thing. Just going to make sure that it's intersected. I don't have any, other than at the bottom now, I don't have any edges that are protruding. So same thing. Just going to rotate this around 90 degrees. Reference. Very important to reference. And we're going to just finish by dropping this down. Reference again. And same thing. So rotate this 180 degrees. Excellent. And I'm just going to intersect these, making sure that they're central, obviously. And there we have it. That basically concludes the first part of the modeling tutorial.